There's a very interesting bit of Targaryen history that I want to talk about today that we're probably never going to be able to get the full answer on unless they decide to reveal it fully in an Aegon the Conqueror movie or something like that. But there's reason to suspect that Aegon the Conqueror's children were not actually his. I'll start by quickly going over the basic evidence as to why some people suspect maybe the Conqueror's children weren't his, but I mostly actually want to focus this video on a part of that conversation that I feel like is often missing when fans discuss this little mystery. Aegon had two wives who were both his sisters, and they went long enough without conceiving an heir that it began to become a little bit of a conversation. The conquest was already completely done, and people were starting to wonder, okay, when are we actually getting a Targaryen heir? Eventually, Rhaenys was pregnant, and she gave birth to a child called Aenys, which is hilarious, and he was the first Targaryen prince that was ever born. Shortly after his birth, his mother was shot down on her dragon over Dorne as she was still trying to subjugate the last of the Seven Kingdoms, and she ended up, dying, never returning. We're not exactly sure if she survived the fall and then was later killed, but either way, his mother was gone, her dragon was gone, and young Prince Aenys began to regress into a much more infant-like little child. He had already been walking and things like that, but once he lost his mother, he began to start crawling again, and people were starting to wonder, okay, is he ever going to be able to actually be the heir to this throne? Is he going to be a capable heir to replace Aegon the Conqueror? This left many people hoping that he would have another child with Visenya, just in case, an heir and a spare, as he often liked to do. But Visenya also seemed to have some trouble getting a child by Aegon, and it wasn't until she was 40 years old that finally she fell pregnant. And people actually even suspect that maybe there was some black magic involved in conceiving this child, or potentially some infidelity. This child would go on to be called Maegor the Cruel, and his cruelty definitely led to many more people suspecting that maybe he was indeed the result of dark magic, but again, something that will probably not be confirmed unless we get more information somehow from George, or in a later Aegon the Conqueror movie at some point. In any case, decades of having multiple wives led to a grand total of two children from Aegon the Conqueror, and one of them at the very least is born under some suspicious circumstances, and this definitely leads to some question as to the other one. Even though him and Rhaenys were definitely very in love, would she have ever slept with somebody else if it was what was required to further the Targaryen dynasty? Well, we don't really know. But in any case, in the history, there is plenty of reason, and many people bring up the suspicion that neither of these children were actually Aegon's. On some level, this would definitely make the Targaryen dynasty somewhat built on a lie. Not entirely, because these are definitely still Targaryens. Their mothers were both obviously Targaryen, so they definitely come from the Targaryen lineage, whether they're pure Targaryen or not. But maybe the dynasty isn't actually descended from the Conqueror, the first Targaryen king. Aenys would grow up into an adult. He didn't stay as a little infant forever, but he was often considered a weak adult, not only by Visenya, who wanted her son to inherit, but by many of the lords of Westeros as well. Aenys would eventually die 5 years into his reign, and some people blame Visenya for his death, but no matter what the case was, Maegor the Cruel became the third Targaryen king. Now, as I said, I don't think I've found any secret special evidence that can say whether or not these children were actually illegitimate, but I do want to point out a really interesting parallel that, as I said, is not often brought up when this conversation comes up. So let's see if you can spot some similarities here to anything else that goes on in Westeros. You have a powerful conquering king who has taken the throne of Westeros and he's starting a new dynasty. He's got two children who end up ruling after him. Both of them are very much suspected by some to be illegitimate. One of them is incredibly cruel, and the other one is sort of a little baby boy. Well, that does sort of sound a lot like the beginning of another dynasty in Westeros now, doesn't it? The one who replaces the Targaryens. This is pretty much the exact situation of Robert and the start of the Baratheon dynasty. Except for we know that Robert's children are illegitimate because it's happening at the time of the main story and we have POV characters who have figured this out. But I want to point out something that's really interesting if Aegon the Conqueror's children were also illegitimate. Nobody cared. At the very least, in the history books, nobody cared. 200 years later, 300 years later, it's fine. He had a cruel son who was ruling for a little while after him, and he had a sort of little babyish son who was ruling for a little while after him, but because nobody blew the whistle on them being illegitimate if they indeed were, the dynasty eventually was able to go on. The history books have shown us that a cruel king or a weak king are types of things that a dynasty can possibly survive. But rumors of infidelity from the very start and a giant civil war that breaks out because of it, well, that seems to be much more damaging. And it sort of makes one wonder what would have happened had Ned Stark and Jon Arryn and these other people not started to blow the whistle on Robert's children. Would the Baratheon dynasty have been able to rule for 300 years? It would have obviously been a fake Baratheon dynasty not descended from Robert, but in terms of his legacy, it would have probably made Robert's legacy much more powerful had everyone just stuck to the script and kept the Baratheon dynasty and his children in power. In 200 years, maybe they would have been talking about Robert the Conqueror, the founder of this Baratheon dynasty, and much like Aegon the Conqueror, there would only be little rumors that maybe his children weren't his, and most people would probably dismiss them. I don't know this for sure, but I do sort of suspect this is actually the reason that George has put these little footnotes in the history books that make us doubt the legitimacy of Aegon's kids because, well, it paints a very interesting parallel to Robert. Robert obviously died thinking that his children were his, and had Ned Stark not blown the whistle, had Stannis not tried to blow the whistle, had all these people just accepted that, yeah, this is the Baratheon dynasty, well, the Baratheon dynasty may have continued for a long time. The history books may talk about how Joffrey the Cruel was the second Baratheon king to rule, but he had a short reign and he died under suspicious circumstances, and then he was replaced by Tommen, who was seen as sort of a weak and ineffective ruler, but the dynasty went on. This would basically be an exact mirror of Aenys and Maegor the Cruel coming right after Aegon the Conqueror, and I think that that is a lot of things that are all lining up to be pretty much matching to the point where I feel like, yeah, George seems to be doing this on purpose, at least in my opinion. Joffrey was taken out at the Purple Wedding in no way because he was illegitimate, just because he was a little shit. He was so bad that he had the people who were trying to marry into the dynasty take him out so that they could actually marry the younger son who was a far better person. So while you can say that Ned was doing the right thing by trying to avoid this cruel boy king taking the throne, well, that was avoided in a different way later on anyway, so that would have been completely fine, and maybe you could have had King Tommen Baratheon marrying Marjorie Tyrell, and the Baratheon dynasty could have been going for a long, long time had the War of the Five Kings never broken out. Granted, in this hypothetical, it depends on what Ned would have done with Sansa, but if he just took Sansa home, broke the marriage betrothal for some other reason, because Joffrey was a terrible person rather than because he was an illegitimate ruler, maybe Joffrey would have been taken out by someone in some other way, because everyone sort of hated the guy, and that's what got him killed in the end anyway. Not the fact that he was bastard born, but the fact that he was a bastard to deal with. I don't know that I would go so far as to say George is like trying to say that Ned Stark was wrong for what he did or anything like that. I just think that it's an interesting question that is the exact type of question that George would like to raise and sort of make people think about. Like, he's not necessarily saying that they shouldn't have rebelled against Joffrey or anything like that, but he is saying that, hey, maybe if no one had figured this out or if people had just looked the other way, it might have actually been better for Robert's legacy and for the dynasty and maybe for the Seven Kingdoms. And it's also sort of an interesting point because, well, it is a little bit funny that the thing that caused Ned to rebel isn't the fact that Joffrey was so cruel, it was the fact that he was illegitimate, and Ned believed that it was very important that the legitimate heir take the throne. And I think obviously today we don't really necessarily think that like bloodline should actually matter that much in terms of who's in charge of a country. So on that level, it doesn't really seem like it's necessarily worth it because, again, everyone would have thought that the dynasty descended from Robert anyway had nobody raised the suspicion. If you assume that Joffrey would have been taken out anyway, and maybe Tommen's line would have been eventually the Baratheon dynasty and everyone would have thought it came from Robert, or even if the dynasty did descend through the crueler of Robert's two children, maybe his son wouldn't have been as terrible as Joffrey was. Well, is that better than having a giant five-way war trying to put one of Robert's legitimate relatives on the throne because bloodlines are super important? When you actually look at how everything turned out for both of these two dynasties, I'm not so sure that's actually an easy question. I do understand that you gotta look out for your bro, and if your best friend is getting cucked on the side and he doesn't know it, you should maybe try and blow the whistle on that, but again, Robert was already dead by the time Ned did anything about any of this. Like, if your best friend had a wife and then they pumped out a kid who you start to suspect doesn't really look too much like your best friend, but your best friend has raised this kid up to being a teenager the entire time thinking that it's his kid, and then tragically your best friend dies in a wild boar hunting accident. Are you then going to go to court and fight to make sure that this kid doesn't inherit what your friend has left to him? I don't know that that's necessarily something that you should be trying to do when you look at that from a modern perspective, and that's the closest thing that we really have, right? Inheritance versus inheriting a kingdom. So, yeah, like, it's a very interesting question that I think is raised by this little situation. So, whenever I look at the situation around the doubt about Aegon the Conqueror's children, this is why I think it's so interesting, because it's such a mirrored situation to the beginning of the Baratheon dynasty. It's pretty much actually the exact reverse, right? You have the cruel child, who's the older one, and the infantile child, who's the second in line. And in this case, the infidelity means that the children are born of incest between brother and sister, whereas in the other case, if they are actually not Aegon's children, it would mean that they aren't born of incest between a brother and a sister. And also, of course, the fact that in Aegon's case it was ignored, whereas in Robert's case it blew up his entire dynasty right after he died. So, in pretty much every way, it is the reverse of the Baratheon situation. I think that's an incredibly interesting footnote in the history of Westeros, and I'd love to hear any of your guys' thoughts on any of that down in the comments. Do you think that this reverse situation is something that George is doing on purpose, or was it just coincidence that it all happens to line up like this? Just another couple things that I want to throw in here quickly that are also paralleled to the Baratheon dynasty. In the first year after the death of Aegon the Conqueror, so Aenys' first year of his rule, there were four uprisings led by four rebels, so sounds at least a little bit similar to the War of the Five Kings. The main difference seems to be that these were much smaller rebellions overall, but if everyone had thought that Aenys was truly not Aegon the Conqueror's kid, who knows, maybe this would have turned into a much bigger deal. And also in the comparisons between Joffrey and Maegor, both of them have a story about cutting open and killing a cat in a very brutal way when they're young. So it goes beyond just them being cruel, they're both cruel in a very specifically similar way, at least in this one instance. There really are a lot of parallels between the beginnings of these two dynasties and with the two heirs and their questions of their legitimacy that I really feel like this is a little bit too much for it all to just be coincidence. Well, let me know what you think about that down in the comments. And do you think that Aegon's children were actually his or not? And do you think that Ned did the right thing, even knowing that maybe Joffrey would have been taken out? Was this actually the right thing to do for Westeros, for Robert's legacy, for all of that stuff? All very interesting questions, and let me know, as I said, down in the comments. And make sure to like and subscribe while you're there. That's all I've got for you for today. I'll be back with something else very soon.